She knew the baby shower wasn't a celebration. It was an ambush. Her ex-husband wanted the whole room to watch her break. Balloons, cake, pastel ribbons, all props for her public destruction. But as Lena pushed open that door, every eye turning toward her, she wasn't empty-handed. No, she carried something that could flip the entire script and end his little performance in one move. He thought she would cry. He thought she would collapse. But what she revealed left the room gasping. And here's the question. If someone turned your deepest wound into their cruelest weapon, would you stay silent, or would you burn the stage they built for you? Before we jump in, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from? And what kind of story do you crave next? Drop your answer in the comments below. If stories like this grip your heart and refuse to let go, well, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I've got another powerful story coming your way tomorrow, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Now, let's get into today's story. He wasn't just rich, he was untouchable. Or so he thought. For years, Richard Hale had been a man who lived above the rules. A billionaire, a mogul, a master of his empire. People didn't just respect him, they feared him, envied him, whispered his name like it carried some mythical weight. He had the kind of wealth that made doors swing open before he even reached them. The kind of influence that could turn enemies into obedient friends with a single phone call. But power has a strange way of twisting a man's vision. It makes him believe the laws of nature, the basic rules of kindness, even the invisible lines of morality, don't apply. And Richard Hale believed all of that. He believed he was invincible. Yet this story is not about his billions or his empire. It's about something much smaller, much more personal, and infinitely more cruel. It begins with an envelope. A plain white invitation that looked innocent enough, but carried venom sealed beneath the flap. When Daniel, Richard's son, slid that invitation into the mailbox, he already knew she would open it. He knew she would hold it in trembling hands and read those words over and over, her chest tightening with every line. He was counting on it. Daniel knew her pride too well. He knew Lena, his ex-wife, would not ignore it. No matter how much it hurt, she would show up. The irony? The card itself was wrapped in cheer. Baby blue ribbons printed along the edges, playful fonts announcing joy, laughter, blessings. Join us in celebrating the upcoming arrival of our little miracle, it read. But behind that cheerful script was Daniel's smirk. Because this invitation wasn't born of joy, it was crafted as a weapon. It was cruelty dressed up in pastel ribbons and frosting-colored ink. For years, Lena's deepest wound had been her infertility. Every test, every appointment, every hollow look from doctors had carved that wound deeper. And Daniel knew that. He knew how she had spent countless nights curled into herself on the bathroom floor, silently sobbing so no one could hear. He had seen how hope drained from her face, little by little, until the woman who once glowed with dreams was left in shadows. Their marriage cracked under that weight, splintered into silence and blame, until one day it collapsed entirely. Divorce papers on the table, a love story in ruins. But Daniel didn't see tragedy. He saw opportunity. When his new wife became pregnant just months after their divorce, he was ecstatic. Not just because he was going to be a father, but because he saw a way to twist the knife in Lena's heart, to show her everything she couldn't have, to watch her crumble in public, surrounded by laughter, pastel balloons, and the smug applause of people who would whisper, "Poor Lena. Look at her now." That was the point of the baby shower. It wasn't celebration. It was theater, a cruel performance designed for an audience. And the star role he cast for his ex-wife was the broken woman, the tragic figure, the one everyone else would pity. That's why the invitation was sent. That's why the ribbons and fonts were carefully chosen. Because Daniel was not interested in kindness. He was interested in spectacle. And as he sealed that envelope, he could already picture it. Lena standing awkwardly in the corner, forcing a brittle smile while his friends and family surrounded him, congratulated him, adored his glowing wife. He imagined Lena's eyes falling on the cake decorated with baby booties and rattles, her throat tightening as he held up tiny onesies with laughter. He imagined her collapse, her silent humiliation, her quiet exit out the back door. He thought that would be his triumph. But here's the thing about cruelty. It often writes its own downfall. Because while Daniel thought he was writing Lena's role in this twisted play, he had no idea she was already writing a script of her own. One that would turn every spotlight in that room directly back on him. When the invitation arrived at her doorstep, Lena did exactly what he knew she would. She froze. She stared at the words until her vision blurred. She felt that old, familiar ache rise in her chest. And for a moment, just a moment, she almost tore it to shreds and tossed it into the trash. But something stopped her. Something small, steady, and sharp. A voice inside her that whispered, "Not this time." Daniel was counting on her pain. He was counting on her silence. But what he didn't count on was how pain, when carried long enough, can transform into something else entirely. Into strength, into defiance, into fire. And so Lena made a decision. She wouldn't stay home. She wouldn't hide. She would walk into that pastel-colored stage he built for her, and she wouldn't come empty-handed. When she looked into the mirror on the morning of the baby shower, she didn't see the shattered woman Daniel remembered. She saw someone new. Someone he could never predict. Someone he could never humiliate. Because the cruelest irony of all was about to unfold. Daniel thought he was hosting a party to destroy her. But what he had really done was set the stage for his own undoing. And as Lena folded the invitation neatly back into its envelope, slipped it into her purse, and picked up the small hands that clung to her skirt, she smiled. A smile Daniel would never forget. But here's the truth you might not expect. Their story didn't begin in venom. It didn't begin in cruelty. Once there was love, real love, the kind that made friends envious and strangers glance twice at the way they looked at each other. Lena and Daniel weren't always enemies, standing on opposite sides of a shattered past. They were once two dreamers who believed the world had handed them something rare and precious. When they met, it was almost cinematic. A crowded bookstore on a rainy afternoon, Lena reaching for the same novel Daniel already had in his hands. Their eyes locked, awkward laughter escaped, and for a moment it felt as if fate itself had written their first line. That spark grew quickly into long evenings of shared wine, whispered plans about the future, and an intimacy that made every day feel like a promise. People around them said things like, "You two are made for each other." And for years, Lena believed it. She believed love alone could withstand anything. They married under a sky thick with stars, promising forever in front of family and friends. And in those early years, forever seemed not just possible but inevitable. They filled notebooks with names for children they didn't yet have. They painted walls in soft colors, set aside money for toys, talked about bedtime stories and family trips. Parenthood wasn't just a dream. It was the foundation of every plan they built. But reality doesn't always match the script we write in our heads. After months of trying, nothing happened. After years of trying, nothing changed. The whispers from doctors grew sharper, filled with words no couple wants to hear. Low chance, complications unlikely. Lena endured tests, treatments, invasive appointments that stripped away her sense of womanhood one sterile room at a time. Daniel stood beside her in the beginning, holding her hand, promising that they were in this together. But promises are fragile things. Each month brought the same disappointment, and with it, small fractures began to spread through the marriage. Fractures that at first seemed invisible, but soon became cracks you couldn't ignore. Nights once filled with laughter turned into silence heavy enough to choke on. Daniel began to avoid conversations, retreating into work, into excuses, into late nights away from home. Lena, left alone, carried the blame on her own shoulders. Every negative test felt like proof she had failed, not just herself, but him. They tried to hide it from others, keeping up the appearance of a happy couple. Smiling at dinners, nodding when people asked about children, saying vague things like, "Oh, we're working on it." But inside, their house became a battlefield. Arguments erupted from nothing, forgotten chores, late arrivals, misplaced words, because beneath every fight was the same raw wound, the child that never came. And when hope finally dried up, when even the doctors shook their heads with pity, something inside Daniel shifted. He stopped saying we, and started saying you. He stopped looking at Lena as his partner, and started seeing her as the source of their failure. Those were the hardest days. To love someone deeply, and then watch that love curdle into resentment is a pain that lingers long after the papers are signed. By the time they divorced, Lena wasn't just heartbroken, she was hollow. She moved through her days like a shadow of herself, haunted by the dream of a family that would never exist. She told no one about the nights she lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering what part of her had been so broken that even love couldn't survive it. And yet, even in that despair, something was quietly shifting. Because pain doesn't only destroy, it can also forge. Beneath the ashes of their marriage, beneath the humiliation and the grief, Lena was being reshaped into someone Daniel would no longer recognize. He thought she was ruined. He thought she was defeated. But the truth, she was only just beginning to rise. And that's the cruel irony Daniel never understood. He believed their story had ended when he walked away, when he left her behind for a new life and a new wife. But endings are rarely what they seem. Sometimes they are doorways. Sometimes they are beginnings in disguise. So when that invitation arrived, when she held it in her trembling hands, she didn't just see a reminder of what she lost. She saw a chance to reclaim something Daniel thought he had taken from her forever. And she decided, in that quiet moment of resolve, that she would not let him write the final chapter of her story. If you were Lena, carrying that kind of pain, facing that kind of cruel invitation, what would you have done? Would you walk into that room or stay behind closed doors? Tell me in the comments, because I want to know what choice you think is braver. Because Lena, she chose the path no one expected. Months after the divorce, Daniel was already parading his new life. Smiling photographs of sonograms with his new wife, Melissa, began flooding timelines. Baby scans captioned with phrases like "our little miracle" and "dreams do come true." To anyone scrolling, it was a heartwarming picture of love reborn. But to Lena, each post was a blade twisting deeper. Every grainy black and white image felt like shattered glass pressed into her chest. She couldn't look away, yet she couldn't bear the sight either. The cruelest part? Daniel knew she would see them. He wasn't sharing them just to celebrate. He was broadcasting a performance, one he wanted his ex-wife to watch. At first, Lena avoided social media. She deleted apps, silenced notifications, tried to shut her eyes against the noise of his happiness. But friends would mention it in passing, relatives would forward screenshots without thinking, and even her co-workers whispered, "Did you see? He's finally going to be a dad." The words weren't meant to cut her, but they did anyway. Because for Lena, it wasn't just a reminder of what she lost. It was proof that her greatest dream had been handed to another woman, wrapped in the arms of the man who once promised forever. Melissa, with her flawless hair and glowing smile, quickly became the center of Daniel's curated world. She was everything Lena wasn't, at least in the way Daniel wanted people to see it. Melissa represented fertility, luck, triumph. And Lena? She was cast as the failed chapter, the ghost in his story. That silent ache followed her everywhere. Grocery store aisles suddenly seemed filled with mothers pushing strollers. Parks echoed with laughter she could never join. Commercials about diapers and lullabies struck like knives. The world seemed to be mocking her, reminding her of what she couldn't give, what she had already lost. And then, the envelope arrived. The invitation to the baby shower. The final stroke of cruelty. Daniel could have celebrated quietly, surrounded by people who truly cared. But he wanted her there. He wanted Lena seated in the back, forced to clap and smile as he paraded his joy. He wanted her humiliated under pastel streamers and confetti. That wasn't kindness. It was strategy. His sharpest blade yet. Lena read the card over and over, her hands trembling, her throat tightening. On the surface, it looked like any other cheerful invitation, balloons, rattles, little footprints sketched along the border. But she could feel the venom dripping from between the lines. Every word screamed, "Look what I have. Look what you'll never have." For a long moment, she considered throwing it into the fire, letting it burn to ash. But then she thought about everything she had endured, every cruel whisper, every night of silent tears. And something inside her shifted. The ache that had once made her fragile was now making her unbreakable. Daniel thought the sight of his perfect family would destroy her. But Lena had a secret, a truth she had kept close, waiting for the right moment. And she realized maybe this was it. From that day forward, the invitation didn't feel like a summons to pain. It felt like an opening, a chance to walk into the very arena where Daniel expected her defeat and turn the spotlight around. She wouldn't come empty-handed. No, she would bring something far more powerful than tears. She would bring proof that her story hadn't ended, that her life hadn't been reduced to silence. Lena's decision set everything in motion. The baby shower wasn't just going to be a party, it was going to be a battlefield of pride, resilience, and secrets no one saw coming. And when Lena stepped through those doors, she wasn't walking into Daniel's story anymore. She was walking into her own. And that's when the game began to change. Daniel, meanwhile, was telling a very different story. To his friends, he wasn't a man preparing to welcome a child into the world. He was a showman rehearsing a performance. He bragged over beers, chuckling in a way that left even his closest buddies uneasy. "Wait until she sees what she missed out on," he said, his voice thick with satisfaction. For him, the baby shower wasn't simply a celebration. It was a weaponized stage. A chance to place his ex-wife in the audience and cast her as the tragic figure, the outsider staring into a life she could never claim. He had planned it down to the smallest detail. The decorations chosen not only for their charm, but for their symbolism. Balloons shaped like bottles, banners that screamed, "It's a boy!" in bold letters, photographs of the ultrasound enlarged and framed so no one could miss them. Even the playlist was carefully curated. Songs about new beginnings, family, futures unfolding. He wasn't building a party. He was building a spectacle designed to wound. Daniel loved the idea of Lena arriving and feeling out of place. He pictured her lingering near the punch bowl, plastering on a smile while conversations swirled around her. He imagined her eyes welling up as gifts were unwrapped. Tiny shoes, pastel blankets, toys that represented everything she had once wanted. In his mind, her pain would be obvious, undeniable, and deeply satisfying. He wanted his new wife to shine, to glow with triumph while his ex-wife stood as living proof of his supposed escape from misery. Melissa didn't see it at first. To her, the baby shower was about joy, about celebrating a child she already adored. But Daniel's hints slipped through in careless comments. It's going to be priceless when Lena sees all this. She'll finally realize what she lost. Melissa laughed nervously, unsure whether to join in or to question the sharp edge beneath his words. Yet she said nothing. Perhaps she thought it was harmless. Perhaps she didn't want to stir the storm that lingered beneath Daniel's smile. The truth, however, is that cruelty rarely remains invisible. Friends noticed the way he spoke about Lena. They caught the way his amusement seemed rooted less in joy for his future child and more in bitterness for his past partner. One even asked, "Are you sure this is a good idea?" But Daniel brushed it off, assuring everyone it would be fine. What he didn't know was that his arrogance was laying the foundation for a humiliation of his own. Because revenge has a strange way of rewriting the script, especially when it arrives in silence, carried by the very person you tried to break. Lena, on the other side of this twisted plan, had no idea of the extent of his bragging. She only knew what the invitation represented, a deliberate attempt to turn her into a spectacle. And while Daniel rehearsed her downfall in his mind, she was preparing something entirely different. Something he couldn't even imagine. Think about that for a second. Have you ever known someone who seemed to live for your failure? Someone who only looked satisfied when you were hurting? Share your story in the comments. I know many watching will relate more than they'd like to admit. Because this baby shower was no longer just a party. It was a crossroads. One man obsessed with proving he'd won, and one woman quietly carrying the proof that he hadn't. And as the date circled closer on the calendar, tension began to coil like a spring. Every streamer he hung, every decoration she prepared, every laugh he rehearsed, all of it was building toward a collision neither of them could avoid. Daniel thought he had written the script. He thought the outcome was certain. But life doesn't work like that. When arrogance meets resilience, something always gives. And when the doors to that baby shower finally opened, it wasn't Daniel's grin that stole the room. It was Lena's entrance. Most people, faced with that kind of cruelty, would have stayed home. They would have shut the blinds, curled into their solitude, and spared themselves the spectacle of public pain. They would have let the invitation burn quietly, unseen, forgotten in the trash. But Lena was not most people, not anymore. The years of heartache had reshaped her into someone harder, steadier, more unyielding than Daniel ever realized. She didn't choose to hide. Instead, she dressed with intention. She chose an outfit that radiated calm confidence, a smile that masked storms, and a presence that carried weight the moment she stepped through the door. And she did not arrive alone. That was the part no one, least of all Daniel, expected. To the unknowing eye, she looked like a woman attending a simple event, a polite guest showing up to honor tradition. But beneath her poised exterior, she carried something far more powerful. Something she had kept quiet, nurturing away from the noise of his boasts and the sting of his laughter. Lena walked into that room not as a broken shadow, but as a force of reckoning. Her silence was about to thunder. In the days leading up to the shower, Lena replayed every possible outcome in her mind. She knew Daniel would smirk, knew he would watch her reactions as if tallying points in a cruel game. She knew Melissa would glow with the smug satisfaction of a woman carrying what Lena never could. And she knew the whispers would swirl the moment she appeared, guests leaning into each other murmuring, "Why would she come? Doesn't it hurt too much?" Every scenario pointed to one conclusion. They expected her defeat. But that was precisely why she went. Because this wasn't about Daniel anymore. It wasn't about Melissa either. It was about reclaiming her dignity, her narrative, her voice. For too long, she had been cast in the role of failure, the woman left behind, the tragic figure whose life ended with a divorce decree. Now she had the chance to show them, without raising her voice, without uttering a single cruel word, that she was more than the story Daniel painted. The choice wasn't easy. The night before, Lena sat awake, staring at the ceiling. Doubt gnawed at her edges. She asked herself if she was strong enough to stand in that room, surrounded by balloons and laughter, without breaking. She wondered if walking away would be the safer option. But then she thought about the years she had spent shrinking, silencing herself, letting others define her worth. She thought about the nights she cried quietly into her pillow while Daniel stayed out late, pretending her pain wasn't his. And in that still, fragile moment, she realized something life-changing. Strength isn't found in hiding. It's found in walking into the fire and refusing to burn. That was the decision that carried her forward. She pressed the invitation flat, set out her clothes, and gathered what she planned to bring. Each step was deliberate, each choice made with clarity. When she looked in the mirror before leaving, she no longer saw the ghost of a woman who had lost everything. She saw resilience wearing human form. And that image, more than anything, gave her the courage to face him. Lena walked in. She carried her secret close to her heart, like a card waiting to be revealed at just the right moment. Daniel thought he knew her limits. He thought humiliation would shatter her. But what he didn't know was that she was prepared to flip the script entirely. As she entered the room, conversations faltered. Heads turned. Whispers spread like wildfire. Daniel's smirk widened, convinced he was watching the opening scene of her unraveling. What he didn't realize was that the unraveling wasn't hers, it was his. And it was only just beginning. The party sparkled with balloons strung from every corner, ribbons curling down to touch the tables, pastel cakes arranged like edible sculptures. Laughter echoed through the air, a performance of joy carefully staged for photographs and memory books. Guests balanced plates of finger foods and glasses of sparkling punch, their chatter weaving together in a hum that masked the undercurrent of anticipation. Then the room shifted. Eyes turned as Lena stepped across the threshold, her heels tapping against the polished floor like the first notes of a song no one expected to hear. Daniel stood near the center, arm draped around Melissa, his smirk already stretching wide. He had pictured this moment countless times. Lena arriving, trying to keep herself together, eyes betraying the agony she surely felt. He wanted to drink in every second of her unraveling. Yet what he saw instead unsettled him. Her expression wasn't brittle. It wasn't desperate. It was sharp, deliberate, unnervingly calm. The kind of smile that didn't hide pain but concealed power. She moved through the room with quiet composure, acknowledging the stares without shrinking from them. People whispered behind napkins and glasses, their curiosity flickering like fireflies. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether her presence was an act of courage or madness. Others leaned closer to one another, murmuring about how awkward it must be, the ex-wife showing up to watch her former husband celebrate his future. But Lena didn't falter. Her steps were measured, her chin lifted, her silence louder than any accusation. Daniel squeezed Melissa's hand, trying to steady himself, though his pulse betrayed the flicker of irritation building in his chest. He had expected tears, not steel. He had imagined defeat, not defiance. And that smile, God, that smile, felt like a blade pointed directly at him. Still, he convinced himself it was an act, a mask she couldn't possibly hold for long. He believed that once the games began, the gifts, the speeches, the toasts, her facade would crumble. Melissa glanced toward Lena, her own features tight with discomfort. She tried to beam, to continue her role as the glowing mother-to-be, but her eyes darted too often in Lena's direction. Guests noticed. A cousin whispered, "She looks stronger than I thought she'd be," while another muttered, "I wonder why she even came." The atmosphere buzzed with unspoken tension, like static before a storm. Lena, meanwhile, chose her place carefully. Not in the shadows, not in the far corner where Daniel expected her to hide, but near enough that every word, every laugh, every glance passed within her reach. She folded her hands lightly, her posture unyielding, her smile unwavering. It wasn't the grin of someone desperate to belong. It was the calm of someone who knew she had nothing left to prove. Back at the center of the celebration, Daniel cleared his throat, trying to reclaim the spotlight. He raised his glass, joked with his friends, leaned into Melissa with exaggerated affection. But the more he performed, the more his smirk looked strained. Because every time his gaze drifted to Lena, he couldn't escape the gnawing thought that she wasn't playing her part. The script he had written was falling apart, unraveling in silence. Guests began to divide in subtle ways. Some clung to Daniel's side, laughing louder than necessary, as if to smother the tension. Others drifted toward Lena, drawn by the poise that radiated from her. It was an invisible shift, but Daniel felt it like a crack forming under his feet. He had built this day to showcase victory, but her presence was already bending the story into something else entirely. And then Lena did something that made the air tighten. She reached into her purse, slowly, deliberately, pulling out a small object wrapped in delicate paper. She held it lightly in her hands, her smile never faltering. Gasps rippled quietly through the crowd as heads turned to see what she was about to reveal. Daniel stiffened, his smirk freezing into something sharper, colder. Because he knew, whatever she had brought, it wasn't the reaction he wanted. And the real show hadn't even started yet. It began as a murmur, soft as fabric brushing against fabric. Guests leaned toward one another, voices dropping to hushed tones. "Why is she here?" one whispered behind a cupped hand. Another shook their head, whispering back, "I can't believe she showed up. Would you ever?" The speculation circled like smoke, curling through the room until the air itself felt charged with unspoken questions. Everyone pretended to sip their drinks, to nibble on pastel cupcakes, but their focus had shifted entirely. The decorations, the music, the carefully planned speeches, all of it dimmed against the sharp brightness of Lena's presence. Daniel caught the whispers and leaned into them, feeding the tension the way a ringmaster encourages applause. He squeezed Melissa's shoulder, whispered in her ear with exaggerated tenderness, made sure every touch was a performance. He laughed louder than necessary, threw sidelong glances at Lena as though daring her to break, inviting the audience to join him in watching the so-called tragedy unfold. To him, the whispers were proof that his plan was working. People noticed her. People wondered. And soon people would pity. That was his intention all along. But then Lena shifted slightly, holding the small package in her hands with a stillness that drew every eye back to her. The wrapping was plain, nothing elaborate, but the way she cradled it made it feel heavier than it looked. Her gaze didn't waver. Her smile didn't tremble. And when she finally spoke, her voice cut through the air like the sudden ring of a bell. "I brought a gift for you." 6 words. Simple. Ordinary. Yet in that moment, they carried the weight of something seismic. The room stilled, the chatter evaporated, and Daniel's smirk faltered. The confidence he had been polishing all afternoon cracked, just slightly, as he processed what she had said. A gift. Not bitterness. Not tears. A gift. Melissa shifted uncomfortably beside him, eyes darting from Lena to the package in her hands. She tried to smile, but it wavered under the weight of the silence. Guests exchanged glances, curiosity sparking in their eyes. What could Lena possibly bring to a shower like this? What message was tucked inside that neat wrapping paper? Daniel cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle that landed flat. "You didn't have to," he said, his tone laced with the smugness he used as armor. "But I guess that's thoughtful." He expected her to flinch, to shrink back into awkwardness. But she didn't. She held her ground, steady and unshaken, her expression betraying nothing but quiet certainty. In that moment, the balance in the room shifted. The whispers changed tone. No longer was the question, "Why is she here?" Now it was, "What does she have?" People leaned closer, waiting, watching, sensing that something was about to unravel in a way none of them had anticipated. The very stage Daniel had designed for humiliation was turning into something else entirely, a theater of suspense, where he was no longer the director. Imagine standing in Daniel's shoes for a moment. You plan an event to showcase your triumph, to prove you've moved on, to parade your happiness in front of the one person you wanted to crush. And then, in front of everyone, she doesn't cower. Could you keep pretending the script was still yours? Tell me in the comments. Daniel tried to regain his composure, tried to remind himself that he was still in control. But his pulse betrayed him, thudding louder with every second. The eyes in the room no longer adored him. They were locked on Lena, on her package, on her calm, unnerving presence. He wanted to dismiss it, to laugh it off as meaningless, but the silence was growing unbearable. And when Lena began to move closer, placing one foot deliberately in front of the other, carrying that package toward him, every pair of eyes followed her. The air thickened, heavy with suspense. Melissa tightened her grip on Daniel's arm, her smile stretched thin as porcelain. The chatter was gone now, replaced with something far sharper: anticipation. Because everyone knew, whatever Lena was about to do, it wouldn't be ordinary. And Daniel's carefully crafted stage was seconds away from collapsing. While Daniel flaunted his new life online, basking in likes and comments, Lena rebuilt. Not loudly, not with grand declarations or curated photos, but quietly, in the shadows where growth often happens unseen. She began where everything inside her had broken: her sense of worth. The divorce had gutted her, not just because of Daniel, but because of what it whispered to her deepest fears. That she wasn't enough, that life had passed her by, that her story was over. For a while, she believed it. She woke in the mornings with heavy silence, her chest aching, her days stretching long and hollow. But pain, if you let it, can be the soil where resilience grows. Piece by piece, Lena stitched herself back together. She joined a local women's group, not just for companionship, but for healing. At first, she was quiet, content to sit in the circle and listen to stories of struggle and survival. Yet slowly, she found her voice. She began to share, to laugh again, to trust that life might still hold beauty. She found purpose in volunteering, working with children at community centers, pouring into little ones the love she had once thought she'd never have a chance to give. And then came the moment that changed everything. One afternoon, a friend introduced her to a program for foster parents. Lena hesitated. Wasn't she too broken, too fragile, too undeserving to be a mother? But the thought wouldn't leave her. Nights later, she found herself filling out forms, attending classes, opening a door she had once believed would remain locked forever. That door led her to the most unexpected gift: family. Not in the way Daniel had imagined it, not in the way Melissa flaunted with her baby bump, but in a way that was hers, unique and beautiful. She welcomed children into her home, children who had been through storms of their own, children who needed safety and love. And in giving them that, Lena discovered her heart had more capacity than she ever thought possible. This wasn't replacement, it was rebirth. With each bedtime story, each scraped knee bandaged, each giggle filling her living room, she rewrote her story. The ache of infertility never fully left, but it softened, reshaped by the laughter of little voices calling her name. She was no longer barren in spirit. She was overflowing. While Daniel flaunted, Lena flourished. The irony was cruel and poetic all at once. He had mocked her silence, paraded his happiness, never realizing she had been crafting something richer than any announcement he could post online. And now, that very truth was about to step into his carefully decorated room, where balloons floated and pastel cakes sat waiting. Because Lena hadn't come alone. Her children, the family she had fought for, nurtured, and built from love, were waiting just outside. They weren't accessories to a plan, they weren't pawns in revenge. They were her life, her joy, the living embodiment of everything Daniel said she would never have. And when the moment came, when she turned toward the door with that mysterious smile still curving her lips, the crowd leaned in, breath held, waiting to see what she would reveal. Daniel's pulse quickened. Melissa's grip on his arm tightened. Whispers started again, sharper now, full of suspicion. Because what no one knew was that Lena's family was about to enter, and their arrival would shatter every assumption, every cruel intention, every ounce of power Daniel thought he held. And the sight of them was going to turn that room upside down. Lena didn't rush. That was the most unnerving part for Daniel. She moved with a grace that commanded silence, a quiet defiance wrapped in dignity. Her hand reached for the door, every movement deliberate, every second stretched so taut the room could have snapped under its own suspense. Guests leaned forward without realizing it, breaths caught midair, waiting. Then the latch clicked. The door opened, and three little faces peeked from behind her. The collective gasp was sharp, as though the room itself inhaled and forgot how to exhale. Balloons swayed gently from the ceiling as if startled by the shift in energy. Pastel colors blurred into the background, every eye riveted on the sight of those children stepping shyly into the glow of the party lights. Triplets. Adopted, adored, and hers. Daniel's smirk didn't just falter, it collapsed. His jaw tightened, eyes darting frantically between Lena and the children, trying to piece together what he was seeing. Melissa's hand slipped from his arm, her expression frozen somewhere between confusion and panic. The whispers erupted instantly, no longer hushed but loud, uncontainable, ricocheting across the room. Are they hers? Wait, she adopted them. 3 at once. Each question stabbed through Daniel's carefully constructed image of dominance. He had expected Lena to be fragile, to come empty-handed, a ghost clinging to memories. Instead, she arrived carrying the very thing he had mocked her for lacking. Not one child, but three, a family multiplied. And not in bitterness, but in abundance. The children clung to her for a moment, then stepped further inside, their wide eyes taking in the balloons and the pastel spectacle. Lena crouched down, whispered something tender to them, and they nodded, small smiles breaking across their faces. That image, Lena surrounded by the very love Daniel claimed she would never have, burned through the party like wildfire. Daniel forced a laugh, brittle and hollow. "Cute," he said too loudly. "Really cute. But this is our day." His voice cracked on the last word, betraying the panic creeping into his chest. Melissa shifted uncomfortably beside him, her glow dimmed, her confidence wilting under the heat of 100 curious stares. Lena rose to her full height, eyes never leaving Daniel's. "You're right," she said softly, her voice calm, steady, and devastatingly sure. "This is your day. And this is my gift, for you to see that I didn't break. I didn't disappear. I became whole." The whispers erupted again, louder this time, cutting through the celebratory music still playing faintly in the background. Guests who had once sided with Daniel now looked at Lena with something else in their eyes. Admiration, maybe even awe. And Daniel felt it. He felt the shift, the unraveling of control, the narrative slipping away no matter how hard he tried to grasp it. Now picture yourself there. Imagine being in that room, watching a woman once branded as broken step forward with strength so radiant it silences the crowd. Would you cheer for her? Tell me in the comments. Lena placed the wrapped package on the table, her children's small hands resting against hers for courage. She didn't gloat. She didn't mock. She simply stood, the embodiment of triumph without cruelty. And in that simple act, she dismantled everything Daniel had orchestrated. Melissa's forced smile flickered, her eyes dropping to the floor. Daniel's laugh had vanished altogether, replaced by a scowl that barely hid his unraveling. Guests exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, others nodding subtly in Lena's direction. The spectacle he had planned had turned into his reckoning, and everyone knew it. But Lena wasn't done. The gift wasn't just the children standing by her side, or the message she carried in her presence. There was something more inside that small, carefully wrapped package. Something meant not to wound, but to expose, to illuminate, to bring the truth fully into the light. She reached for it again, her fingers brushing over the paper, her smile unwavering as the whispers died down once more. All eyes returned to her. The music stuttered to a stop. Even the children sensed the weight of the moment, their hands tightening around her arms. And when Lena began to peel back the paper, slow and deliberate, Daniel felt his chest seize. Because whatever was inside was going to finish what she had started. For the first time that day, Daniel's grin faltered. The expression he had worn like a crown, smug, untouchable, rehearsed, slipped off his face as though gravity itself had pulled it down. His laughter had dried up earlier, but now the silence that wrapped around him felt like a spotlight exposing every fracture. The room that had been his stage only moments ago, the pastel balloons, the meticulously arranged cakes, the smiling guests he had imagined as his audience, no longer belonged to him. Every eye had shifted, every ear strained for Lena's next move. The center of gravity had changed, and it was her. She stood where he thought she would crumble, her children flanking her like quiet sentinels, her composure unshakable. The very silence Daniel had planned to use against her now hung heavy over him, echoing back the cruelty he once wielded like a weapon. His cruelty had backfired in the loudest silence imaginable. Melissa's face gave her away before Daniel even realized how much ground he was losing. Her smile, carefully pinned in place for the celebration, quivered at the edges. She shifted her weight, her arms slipping slightly from his. Her eyes weren't on the guests or the decorations. They were locked on Lena, on the package she held, on the children whose presence had already rewritten the entire narrative of the day. Daniel felt heat crawl up the back of his neck. He tried to laugh again, tried to inject humor into the moment, but the sound caught in his throat. The people who once looked at him with admiration were now staring with something colder, scrutiny. Whispers darted from corner to corner, fragments of sentences carrying like sparks. He invited her to humiliate her. Look at her now. This is uncomfortable. And uncomfortable was not what Daniel wanted. He had wanted spectacle, triumph, validation. Instead, he stood exposed. His grand plan had turned on him with precision sharper than any insult Lena could have spoken aloud. Lena finally began unwrapping the package, each tier of paper deliberate, unhurried. The sound of the paper ripping was deafening in the hushed room. She looked at no one but Daniel as she unfolded the layers, her children clinging softly to her skirt as though they too sensed the importance of the moment. Daniel's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing, but there was nothing he could do. Interrupting would make him look desperate, and standing silent made him look weak. Lena lifted the final layer of paper to reveal a framed photo. Gasps rippled through the room again. It wasn't just any photo, it was the first family portrait she had taken with the triplets. In it, she looked radiant, glowing with the kind of joy no staged shower could replicate. The children's faces beamed with innocence and love, their arms wrapped tightly around her. It wasn't posed perfection. It was raw, real, undeniable proof of the life she had created. The crowd erupted in quiet awe. Some smiled warmly, others blinked back unexpected tears. The contrast between Lena's authentic joy and Daniel's orchestrated performance could not have been starker. Melissa's hand slipped completely from his arm. Daniel's own family members exchanged uneasy glances, their support wobbling under the weight of truth. Daniel tried to force a chuckle, but his lips refused to cooperate. His throat felt tight, his chest heavy. For years, he had defined Lena by what she lacked, used her pain as a punchline, convinced himself her story ended the moment he walked away. But here she was, her children clinging to her hands, her photo radiating proof of a love deeper than anything he had flaunted. The guests knew it. Melissa knew it. And worst of all, Daniel knew it too. But Lena hadn't spoken her final word. Not yet. Her silence had already thundered. Her presence had already shifted the ground. Yet the look in her eyes suggested something more was coming, something that would leave no doubt about where the power truly rested. And Daniel, for the first time, looked afraid. Suddenly, the whispers turned. The sharp, gossipy tones that had once circled Lena like vultures transformed into something softer, warmer. Guests moved instinctively toward her, drawn as if gravity itself had shifted. They leaned down to coo at the triplets, marveling at their identical grins, their matching eyes, their shy giggles. Hands reached out to ruffle hair, to offer little toys, to ask names. The tension that had once isolated Lena now swaddled her in admiration. She wasn't the spectacle anymore. She was the star. Daniel's relatives, the very people he had invited to witness her downfall, were now circling her instead. An aunt bent low, whispering about how beautiful the children were. A cousin snapped photos on her phone, unable to resist capturing the scene. Strangers who had barely noticed Lena before leaned closer, speaking words of praise that carried through the air like confetti. The balloons, the streamers, the pastel cakes, all of it faded into background noise as the true celebration unfolded around her. Melissa forced a smile, her lips twitching with strain. She clutched her belly protectively, trying to anchor herself in her own glow, but her radiance dimmed next to Lena's calm light. Every glance she stole toward her husband revealed the truth she didn't want to face. He wasn't in control. His plan had unraveled in front of everyone, and the woman he had labeled broken now stood untouchable. And Daniel, he was invisible in his own spotlight. He tried to interject, clapping his hands too loudly, raising his voice with false cheer. Everyone, let's not forget, today is about us. About our baby. But the words landed hollow. Guests nodded politely, yet their attention slid back to Lena and her children. His laughter, once commanding, now sounded desperate. The more he pushed, the more the crowd resisted, drifting toward her with a natural ease that he couldn't replicate. It was a reversal so sharp it sliced through his pride. He had built this day as a monument to his triumph. Now it was a monument to hers. Lena didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply smiled at her children as they were showered with gentle attention, answering questions with quiet grace, her composure untouched by Daniel's unraveling. Her silence screamed louder than any accusation could, and the guests understood it. They weren't blind. They pieced together the cruelty behind the invitation, the intent to wound. And now, faced with the reality of Lena's strength, their sympathies shifted entirely. Let me ask you something. If you had been in that room, watching Daniel's smugness crumble and Lena's strength shine, who would you have stood beside? Tell me in the comments. Daniel's mother stepped forward, her hand brushing Lena's shoulder. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "They're beautiful. You must be so proud." That small gesture was a dagger to Daniel's ego. His own family had abandoned the role he cast for them. They weren't laughing with him anymore. They weren't fueling his cruelty. They were celebrating the woman he had tried to destroy. Melissa shifted uncomfortably, her hands trembling as she held her drink. She whispered to him, but the words didn't carry far. He ignored her, his focus locked on Lena. Rage bubbled beneath his skin, disguised poorly as forced calm. He couldn't accept this loss, not here, not in front of so many witnesses. The triplets, innocent to the storm swirling around them, laughed as they played with ribbons dangling from balloons. Their giggles filled the room, the kind of pure sound that couldn't be staged. And with every laugh, every coo from a guest, every admiring glance, Daniel's invisibility deepened. His cruelty hadn't just failed. It had backfired so spectacularly that the memory of it would follow him long after the balloons deflated. But Lena wasn't finished. Not yet. The framed photo had already cracked his facade. The children had stolen his spotlight. The guests had shifted sides. And still, she had more to reveal. Daniel's chest tightened. His smile, already fractured, now threatened to collapse entirely. He clenched his fists in his pockets, desperate to hold on to whatever scraps of control he could salvage. Because deep down, he knew the worst was still coming. Daniel thought, this wasn't the plan. She was supposed to break. For weeks, he had savored the image of her walking in timid, fragile, swallowed by the sight of pastel balloons and baby-shaped cookies. He had imagined her blinking back tears, sitting quietly in a corner while everyone laughed at her expense. That was the story he wanted. The barren ex-wife drowning in envy while he basked in fatherhood. Yet the reality before him was a nightmare he couldn't escape. But Lena didn't break, she bloomed. She stood taller than he remembered, her children clustered around her, her composure impenetrable. Every time she smiled at a guest, every time she spoke with measured grace, the crowd tilted further in her favor. Daniel felt like he was watching his own kingdom crumble stone by stone, his throne dismantled in silence. It wasn't just that Lena had survived, it was that she had transformed. And that transformation revealed an ugly truth. Who really lost? He tried to steady his breathing, but his mind betrayed him. Thoughts raced too fast, crashing into each other. How did she do this? How did she find them? Why didn't I know? Why didn't anyone tell me? He had convinced himself he was untouchable, that his cruelty would be buried under the weight of his wealth, his charm, his carefully curated life. But Lena had dismantled his illusions in seconds, not by fighting, but by existing. The more he looked at her, the more he saw the chasm between them. His new marriage, his carefully staged baby shower, the false laughter. It all felt shallow compared to the raw authenticity glowing from Lena's side of the room. He hated it. He hated how her silence was louder than his laughter, how her children's presence meant more than any toast he could give. Melissa tugged on his arm, whispering, "Daniel, just let it go." But he couldn't. Letting go meant surrender. Letting go meant admitting he had been wrong. Not just to Lena, but to himself. And that was something his pride refused to allow. Now imagine yourself in Daniel's position, watching the person you thought you destroyed rise above you, stronger and brighter than ever. Would you admit defeat, or would your ego push you deeper into the fire? Be honest in the comments. Daniel's inner monologue grew darker. She's embarrassing me. She's turning them against me. They were supposed to see her as pathetic, not powerful. This was supposed to be my story, not hers. His palms began to sweat. His throat ached. He looked around the room, desperate to find an ally, someone still on his side. But every pair of eyes told the same story: curiosity, admiration, even pity. And none of it was directed at him. He thought of the years he had spent ridiculing her behind closed doors, the nights he had dismissed her tears, the smugness with which he flaunted Melissa the moment their divorce was finalized. He had painted Lena as barren, forgotten, irrelevant. Yet now she was everything he wasn't: whole, complete, radiant. And the bitterness of that realization gnawed at him like acid. Melissa stepped slightly away from him, her hand resting on her belly, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She could feel it too, the shift, the fracture in the image they had tried to project. She whispered again, "Please, Daniel, don't make this worse." But his mind wasn't listening. The echo of Lena's words, "I didn't break. I became whole," rang louder than anything else. They weren't just words. They were truth. And that truth carved deep, cutting through the layers of arrogance he had built around himself. His jaw clenched, his pulse hammered, his vision blurred slightly at the edges. He wanted to speak, to reassert himself, to remind the room that this was his day. But deep inside, he knew that anything he said now would sound hollow. and that terrified him. Because Daniel Hale was a man who had lived his entire life on appearances, on charm, on control. And now, for the first time, none of it mattered. The crowd didn't see him as a victor anymore. They saw him as small, and he couldn't bear it. Here's the cruel irony. The shower meant to expose her emptiness revealed his. For all the balloons, the glittering decorations, the curated playlists designed to impress, nothing could disguise the hollowness now radiating from him. Daniel had crafted an event to cement his dominance, yet standing there, surrounded by eyes that no longer revered him, he looked less like a victor and more like a child caught lying. Because Lena's strength outshined Daniel's pettiness. It wasn't her words that crushed him. It wasn't even the triplets who had become the center of affection. It was the unshakable poise she carried into the room. The calm dignity of someone who had already fought her battles in silence and won long before stepping through the door. That was the kind of strength no party trick could counterfeit, no performance could outshine. And revenge never needed venom, only truth. The truth was that Daniel had always defined himself by what he could take from others. Their admiration, their laughter, their envy. But Lena's presence proved something far more devastating. He had no power left to take. His cruelty was stripped of its teeth, leaving him exposed, fragile, smaller than he had ever appeared. Lena, for her part, did nothing more than smile faintly as guests crowded around her, their voices rising in admiration. She didn't gloat. She didn't throw sharp words across the room. She let the reality speak louder than any jab ever could. And it did. Every whisper that once targeted her now turned like a mirror, reflecting his cruelty back onto him. Daniel's thoughts began to spin in dangerous loops. What are they thinking? Do they pity me? Do they see me as weak? His pride clawed at him, desperate to reclaim ground. He wanted to stomp the moment out, crush it before it spread too far. But no matter how hard he tried to compose himself, his face betrayed him. The fake grin twitched at the corners, cracking like glass under strain. Melissa's discomfort grew clearer. She adjusted her dress, her hand lingering on her belly, as though protecting her child from the storm she sensed brewing. Her eyes darted between Daniel and Lena, torn between the husband who demanded loyalty and the ex-wife whose quiet triumph was undeniable. It was a moment where even Melissa seemed to recognize the imbalance, not just in the room, but in her marriage. Now let me ask you, have you ever seen someone so desperate to control a story that their own lies collapse under the weight of truth? Tell me in the comments. The irony deepened as Daniel's mind raced. He thought cruelty had been his weapon, but now it was his cage. Every cruel choice he'd made, the public taunts, the smug social media posts, the staged party, had led to this exact moment where he was trapped, suffocating under the spotlight he once loved. It wasn't Lena who had humiliated him. He had humiliated himself. Guests continued to drift closer to her. A friend of his mother's bent to kiss one of the children's heads. A cousin asked if Lena needed help carrying their toys. Even the photographer he had hired to capture the event tilted the lens toward her, not him. Snap after snap immortalized the reversal, Lena radiant, Daniel shrinking. And he felt it. Every flash was a nail in the coffin of his image. Every laugh aimed in her direction was a reminder that he no longer owned the room. Every whispered compliment about her strength was a dagger in the ego he had once polished daily. The cruelest part? No one needed to say his name to know who had lost. His absence in the conversation was louder than any insult. He had become a ghost at his own party. But Lena still hadn't spoken the words that hovered on her lips. She had delivered her gift, shown her children, revealed her wholeness. Yet her eyes told a story, that the final blow had not yet landed. She was waiting, measuring the moment, preparing to let truth cut deeper than silence ever could. And Daniel's chest tightened, because somewhere inside, he knew her final words would shatter him completely. After that day, Daniel's friends saw him differently. The confident man who once commanded attention at dinners and outings, who reveled in laughter at Lena's expense, no longer carried the same aura. In their eyes, something had shifted. His edges dulled. His stature diminished. The myth of his dominance had fractured in real time, and once the illusion collapsed, it could not be rebuilt. Not as a proud father-to-be, but as a small man consumed by spite. Whispers followed him long after the guests left the pastel-covered venue. At the office, in private chats, at family barbecues. Everywhere he went, the story trailed behind him. People didn't remember the carefully arranged cakes, the pristine decorations, or even the speeches he tried to give. They remembered Lena's entrance, her children's laughter, the framed photograph glowing in her hands. They remembered his forced grin, his faltering voice, the cracks in his mask. His humiliation became folklore among the circles he once dominated. Humiliation, once his weapon, became his mirror. Daniel noticed it in the pauses during conversations, in the pitying smiles from colleagues who had once envied him, in the way people exchanged glances when his name came up. Nobody said it directly, but he could feel it in the shift of their tones, the way respect had curdled into judgment. They no longer admired him. They pitied him. And Daniel Hale hated pity more than anything. Melissa felt it too. Invitations that once arrived weekly began to slow. Friends who used to clamor for double dates grew quiet. At gatherings, conversations drifted toward Lena, toward her courage, her children, her transformation. Melissa tried to laugh it off, tried to frame Daniel as misunderstood, but the truth gnawed at her. She had seen the cracks herself that day, the panic in his eyes, the cruelty unraveling into something pathetic. And though she carried his child, part of her wondered if this was the legacy she wanted for her own family. Now let me ask you, have you ever watched someone's reputation dissolve in front of everyone, not through scandal, but through the raw exposure of their true character? Share your thoughts in the comments, because I think we've all witnessed how fragile reputations can be once the truth emerges. Daniel tried to reclaim control. He doubled down on his image online, posting pictures of nursery furniture, of Melissa smiling in maternity clothes, of himself toasting with colleagues. But the comments told the story he couldn't rewrite. Subtle jokes, backhanded compliments, thinly veiled references to Lena's triumph. He deleted posts, blocked certain voices, yet the digital echo followed him everywhere. He couldn't erase what had been witnessed in real time by too many eyes. The cruelty of social fallout is that it doesn't strike all at once, it spreads. Slowly, like cracks in glass, it grows until the entire surface shatters. For Daniel, it meant invitations missed, phone calls unanswered, colleagues who no longer leaned into his jokes. It meant Melissa's friends exchanging glances she couldn't quite interpret. It meant the quiet dread of realizing that the power he once held had been transferred, permanently, to the woman he tried to destroy. Lena, meanwhile, didn't have to say a word. She never posted about that day. She didn't brag, didn't throw fuel on the fire. She simply lived, her life blossoming alongside her children. But the less she said, the more powerful her silence became. People filled the gaps themselves, retelling the story of the baby shower until it grew into legend. The day the ex-wife walked in and turned humiliation into victory. And Daniel knew, no matter what he did, no matter how much money he spent, no matter how loudly he protested, he could never undo it. The stain was permanent. The whispers had settled into truth. But worse than the whispers was the growing doubt within Melissa's eyes. If the woman carrying his child began to see him as small, then his empire wasn't just cracked, it was doomed to collapse. And as the months rolled forward, Daniel began to feel the walls closing in.
Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this story moved you, the next one will hit even deeper. It's more gripping, more unexpected, and waiting for you right now. Don't hesitate. Click the video on your screen, and I'll see you in the next story.